everyone. Welcome to Writer of the Week. Today we're here with Kari Bovee, author of the Annie Oakley Mystery Series. Welcome, Kari. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
Great. So we're going to start off with you reading an excerpt from Peccadillo at the Palace. Can you set the scene for us?
Yes. So the Wild West show is on their way to England to perform for Queen Victoria's Golden Jubilee celebrations. And so they have boarded the ship, and Annie's horse has been nervous, and so she's been concerned about him. But they've now gotten on board and they've gotten things settled. So this is the beginning of chapter 2. Once on board, Annie and the Colonel walked their horses to the 12 by 12 foot wooden pens that served as stalls situated in front of the other horses' pens, which were indeed smaller. Annie led Buck inside and slipped the halter off his head. She jumped out of the way as the horse started to pace and scooted out the stall door, held open for her by Bobby Brady, one of the show's players and Annie's dear friend. Bobby had joined the Wild West show a year before Annie. When Annie came on, she and Bobby had immediately formed a friendship, despite the fact that in the show shootouts and competitions, Annie beat him every time. Bobby also held a special place in the Colonel's heart. The Colonel had lost his only son at age 6, and years later, Bobby had stepped into the role. In addition to performing with Annie, Bobby often worked with the horses as a farrier, shoeing them and trimming their feet. He loved horses, especially Buck. Annie could see the concern on Bobby's face as Buck stamped and snorted, kicked and reared in his stall. How would they ever make the long voyage to England? "I ain't never seen Buck so upset," Bobby said, closing the stall door. "Not since you first boarded him on the train to St. Louis." "I know, he has a hard time in new environments. I feel right sorry for the fella. I know how he feels." "Are you nervous, Bobby?" Annie used Buck's halter to secure the gate latch to prevent him from busting through it. "I'm downright scared, Annie. What if the ship goes down in the middle of the ocean? I ain't never learned to swim." Bobby's lips pressed together in a thin line, and Annie thought she saw his chin quiver. She smiled at him. "Well, I know how to swim, and so does Frank. If the ship goes down, I promise we'll seek you out." Just as Annie mentioned his name, Frank appeared, coming around the corner. Huldah trailed after him with a scowl on her face, her eyes trained on Annie's dress. Annie looked down at the front of the garment, which was wet from Buck's frothing mouth. "They're waiting for you to go to the railing for the send-off celebration." Frank came up behind her and set his warm hands on her shoulders. "I'll be there in a minute. I just want to see that Buck is settling. Even the big stalls are small compared to the pen he stayed in during the show in St. Louis." Annie couldn't keep the concern out of her voice. She swallowed another wave of nausea and rubbed a hand across her belly as she noted the billowing clouds flatten, turning a deeper shade of ash. "The crew will take the horses out for walks around the deck daily," Frank said, squeezing her shoulders. "You can't take care of everyone and everything, my darling." He smoothed his blonde mustache, looking at her with the quiet compassion she'd loved from the moment she met him. "I know, it's just—" "You mustn't worry so, Annie," Huldah said, scrunching her brow in adolescent disgust. "If you want to worry about something, worry about what people will think of the state of your dress." Annie ignored her sister's scolding. "I suppose we must make an appearance," Annie sighed. "Come on, Bobby." Bobby stood frozen to the spot, his mouth hanging open like a barn door on a sagging hinge as he stared unabashedly at Huldah. Annie stifled a snort. "Oh, forgive my manners. Bobby, this is my sister Huldah." Huldah opened her blue eyes wide at Bobby. After twisting his hat completely out of shape, he took her hand. "Delighted to meet you," Huldah said sweetly. Annie knew that Huldah had seen the awestruck expression on Bobby's face, and also knew she'd use his infatuation to her amusement. Poor Bobby. Annie hoped she wouldn't have to intervene when Huldah broke his heart. Frank wrapped his arm around Annie's waist and pulled her away from the stall. Together, the four of them headed to the upper deck to greet the thousands of fans waiting on the docks below.
So your love of writing began in the 3rd grade, and after college you even held a job as a technical writer. We'd love to know more about your background and writing journey.
I grew up moving a lot with my dad's career, and I think I went to 13 schools in 12 years or something silly like that. And reading really helped me to cope with all of the changes in my life as, as a young girl. And in middle school and high school, I did a lot of journaling, just writing about my feelings and things that were happening. And then I also wrote a lot of short stories and poetry. And then when I got into college, I worked really hard to get all of my required courses out of the way so that in my senior year, I could take independent studies where I'd be working one-on-one with my professors. And so I did that. And it was fabulous because I took a course in screenwriting and one in playwriting and one in short story writing. And it was just me and my professors. So I had that one-on-one attention that was really validating to me as a young writer. And then after college, I took a job as a technical writer and did that until I moved to Houston, Texas, around the time I got married. And then I started teaching school, and I taught middle school, which was a great experience. The school was in some financial trouble, so I was let go. And then I got a job working as an educational consultant and taught teachers in the impoverished areas of the Mississippi Delta on how to engage their students in learning about math and science through art and art projects. And it was really quite fulfilling. And I'm not necessarily a math and science person. As a matter of fact, I'm pretty terrible at math and science, but because we were using art, it was a great way to kind of reach out, and it was really fun. And then after we moved back to California, I taught first grade for a time, but then quit when I had my first child. And my husband and I had made the decision that I would stay home with her, which was fabulous, and I don't regret it for a second, but I was really craving an intellectual outlet, and so that's when I started writing novels.
Do you think the courses in screenwriting helped you create dialogue scenes in your books?
I do, because I had to do some studying of, screenplays and screenwriting, and it really does kind of help your words to become a lot more expedient because you're showing action and you're showing, emotion through dialogue. So it was very helpful.
And you have a degree in English literature, and you said you feel a very deep connection to England. How did that come about?
Well, I just really got fired up by my 19th and 20th century English lit courses. And we read a lot of the classics, and, including, works by Dickens, the Bronte sisters, Jane Austen, George Eliot. And I just really loved the social commentary of those times, particularly where women were concerned. So, and a lot of these writers were women writing as men with pen names, men's pen names, which I thought was interesting. And because that was the only way they could be taken seriously. And then later on, when I was in my early 30s, my mother and I took kind of a girls' trip to England. I had always wanted to go because of my coursework in school. And at that time, I was reading a lot of Mary Stuart and her Arthurian books. And so I was really interested in the Arthurian legends. And I don't know if you've ever heard of the book, The Crystal Cave, and those. She did a Arthur series, and then she did a Merlin series. And so I wanted to see the places where these legends sort of took place. And so one of the places we visited was Tintagel on the west coast of England. Beautiful, beautiful area. Rolling, green hills and craggy cliffs, and, the ocean, the waves crashing up on the cliffs. And this was the supposed birthplace of Arthur. And I just felt very connected to the place in kind of an otherworldly way, like I'd been there before or something. And the sensation was a little bit unnerving, but it was also wonderful. And I've been back to England a few times since, and I still get that feeling, especially on the Cornish coast or in the Cotswolds. And I'm not sure if I believe in reincarnation or not, but if it does exist, I must have lived in England.
Wow, that's incredible. Do you think Annie Oakley has anything in common with the Bronte heroines who seem very demure on the surface?
I think maybe just by the fact that she always sort of maintained her femininity. She was very modest, and she was raised Quaker and very concerned about her reputation, her good name. So maybe in that sense, but she also she had to make a living at a young age, and so I think that sort of changed things for her. That she, I suppose she could have taken a job as a washerwoman, or was in service, but she ended up using her talent as a markswoman, a shooter, to help her family.
So while Annie Oakley was breaking the mold in some ways, she was conforming in others. That's a very interesting dichotomy.
Sure, and I think that was very common for women, even empowered women who were paving the way for the future of all women, like Annie Oakley. But I think they were still women of their times, and that's what they knew.
So you were first introduced to Annie Oakley on a more profound level in a PBS American Experience special suggested to you by your father. What was your reaction to her, and how did her personality and the challenges she faced resonate with you?
Well, I suppose I never knew much about Annie Oakley other than, some of the clips I had seen of the Broadway play, Annie Get Your Gun, and she was portrayed almost as a one-dimensional, cartoonish type character. And when I watched the special, I was amazed at how she handled the adversity in her own life. She was a small woman, a small child. She never grew above 5 feet, but she had such grit and determination. She started shooting game to help put the food on the table after her father died when she was 8 years old. And she was also farmed out at a very young age to another family to help her mother make ends meet. I think she made something like 50 cents a month or some ridiculous amount of money, which wasn't very much. So the family that she went to stay with was abusive, and she never really spoke about them except for to refer to them as the wolves. And she experienced all this hardship before she was 12 years old. And after she escaped from the wolves, and she did indeed escape, she went back home and worked on her shooting skills. And she became such a good shot, she could actually shoot live birds in the air in the back of the head, which made them valuable because there was no shot in the meat. And so she was able to sell these birds at the local mercantile and thus make money and continue to help support her family. So she was scrappy and she was practical, and that's one of the things that I really loved about her.
I had no idea she was so short. Do you think that had to do with the malnourishment from her abusive upbringing, or was she just naturally short like that?
I don't know. I people were smaller then, and so I don't know if that was particularly short. I mean, I think it probably was, and possibly possibly had to do with the impoverishment that she underwent. I don't think the family was ever completely starving, but who knows. But yeah, she was very diminutive, very tiny, and that was part of her charm. She always had this girlishness about her, even when she was older.
Kind of like the spunky heroine in modern rom-coms.
Right, exactly.
So as a historical writer and researcher, you cast a personal, very human light on historical figures, including their motivations, choices, and most interestingly, whether they were aware that they were changing history. Can you tell us more about the angle you approached this from and how it enriches your life?
Well, in my research of Annie Oakley and other historical figures, I discovered that although we knew about them through things they did or things they might have said, all of these things were recorded in history, but we can never really know how they really felt about things, what their internal motivations were, what they were afraid of, what they, was there an unrequited love in their life? Did they always feel inadequate? Did they, have a God complex? I mean, there's all these things that looking in the history books and doing any kind of research, you can't really know that. So I found that very interesting in building the fictional character of Annie Oakley from the historical figure. And, as to if, she was aware that she was changing history, I think some of the historical figures absolutely were, and I think they set out to change history. But I don't believe that Annie Oakley was. I think that she was helping to pave the way for women of the future without realizing it, by just being herself and doing what she was good at, which was shooting, which was something that was, pretty gender specific to men. And that's what made her interesting, I think, in that time period and even today.
So women were not forbidden from owning guns back then?
I don't know about that. I don't think they were forbidden from owning guns. I just don't think they ever found themselves, in a role where they needed to use them, because they were usually inside. They were homemakers, and they took care of things inside the home, and then the men took care of things outside the home. So I just think it was a situational circumstance that she found herself in that made her so unique.
And how did you extrapolate and discern these human qualities from the sometimes dry history books?
Well, a lot of it was my imagination. I read a lot about her. I've read a lot of things written about her. I, kind of studied it, and I thought about the female archetype of the Amazon woman, who is someone who is a protector of women and children, and sort of worked that all in together. And a lot of it came from my imagination, that she, it was obvious that she cared about her family because she had to help support them. So I made this a very fundamental part of her personality as a character. And also that she, so why wouldn't that expand to others that she cared about? Buck, for instance, and then later on Frank, and then, her contemporaries in the Wild West show. And then why wouldn't she be really driven to seek the truth and seek justice for these people? So that kind of led me to, wow, she could be a really interesting amateur sleuth. And she was certainly smart. She wasn't terribly well educated, but she had a lot of native intelligence, and I think she used that. And that's why I brought in the character of Emma Wilson, who's the suffragette journalist that becomes Annie's sidekick, because she's a much more worldly person, and she is intentionally setting out to change the lives of women. And she has a lot more knowledge about some of these things than Annie did because of Annie's lack of education. So I thought they made a good pair.
So Annie Oakley did not have a personal diary that you could use?
No, she didn't. So, there are quotes that she, people have listed quotes of hers, and, there were things that she said and did. My husband bought me a first edition biography of Annie Oakley that was written in like the early 1900s. So it was a pretty close account. And so, I took some of that information, but no, I don't think she was much of a writer.
The biographer that you mentioned, did he actually interview Annie?
No, but it was family members and people who knew her.
Oh, wow. So that would probably the most personal source of your material then.
It was such a great gift. It was completely awesome.
So Annie Oakley led a very unique life, especially given women's cultural roles in the late 1800s. If she were alive today, do you think she would have stood out as much? Would she be up on a podium giving an inspiring speech on female empowerment? Or do you think her voice would have blended in with the others? As she kind of swapped through the norms of her day, how much of that do you think was related to the time period, and how much to her innate characteristics?
Well, first of all, I think that Annie Oakley was more of a doer. I think she was a woman of action, and she may not have been on a podium giving some intellectual speech about women's empowerment or something like that. But she did teach many women, thousands and thousands of women, to shoot for self-defense. And she felt that every woman had a right to defend herself. And so she kind of embarked on this crusade to help women, learn how to defend themselves. So in that way, I think it was more of an action-based agenda than, inspiring people with her words. And, as I mentioned before, one of the most empowering things about Annie Oakley was the fact that she was just being herself. She used the talent she had, which was pretty, like I said before, gender specific to men, and she used it to benefit her family and to benefit herself. It ended up getting her a job with the Wild West show, and then it led to her becoming, America's darling of the late 19th century. She became wildly, wildly famous. I mean, Kardashian famous. So, which is something also I think we in current day take for granted, how famous worldwide she was, not just in the US.
And what city was she based in?
She grew up around Greenville, Ohio. And then she, of course, traveled with the Wild West show. She and Frank went on the road before they joined the Wild West show, which is actually what happened in history. In my books, I shorten that period I alter the timeline a little bit to have her join the Wild West show at 15 when she meets Frank Butler. But they actually did quite a lot of traveling around. They lived in tents. They lived in hotels, on train cars. But she and Frank bought a home in New Jersey, which was kind of a place where they were, settled down in, and they would go there to refresh before they'd go on the road. So that's where she spent her adult life.
What were the channels of fame back in those days? Just newspapers and word of mouth, or how did she get so famous worldwide?
Well, yes, newspapers. There were also the dime novels that were, very popular in the 1800s. And, Bill Cody was the hero of many of those dime novels. And so anywhere he went, and she was one of, the main headliners of his show, then it was a word of mouth thing. And yes, newspapers. I think there was some telegraph, but I don't know how instrumental that would have been. But, flyers, posters, things like that.
And I understand that you are a horsewoman. How long have you had horses, and what do they bring to your life?
I've had horses since I was about 11 years old. I was one of these, late bloomers physically, and my parents really wanted me in some kind of a physical activity, some kind of sport. And they, we had tried a couple of things. We had tried dance, and, I wasn't terribly coordinated at the time. And then we tried softball, and that didn't work out. And so one day my mom said, I have a surprise for you. And so we walked to the local stables, and she said, I've signed you up for riding lessons. And I was terrified. I thought, what have I done wrong that she is punishing me in this way? And so the woman who gave me my first riding lessons was a wonderful older woman, and she was terribly allergic to horses. So she was puffing on her inhaler like every half an hour. But she got me up there and she gave me a lesson, and I was hooked. I completely fell in love. And so then I got my first horse at 11, and it was kind of a bad experience. We didn't realize it, but she was ill. The mare was ill. So we had to have her put down, which was very traumatic. But this horse trainer who I had mentioned was such a wonderful woman, and she felt so bad about the situation that she ended up buying me another horse. And I had that horse for years and started showing, competing with that horse. And so I did that through probably my last year of high school. And then of course I went off to college, and then couldn't really afford to have horses. And then when my children were, I think, 12 and 9, we went to England. It was one of our England trips, and they begged me to take them riding. So we went out riding, all through the English countryside, which was amazing. And my daughter said, Mom, you grew up riding horses. Why haven't we done this before? So I got her into it. And then, of course, until she, went off to school. And so I was stuck with these very beautiful, show horses. And I thought, well, I'm going to get back into it. So that's when I got into it. And then about 10 years ago, I got interested in natural horsemanship, which is sort of a philosophy based on the horse's psychology and learning how to communicate with horses in a way that they understand, which is through body language and, just a more natural approach, which was completely refreshing for me. So that's what Annie is attempting to do in these books is have a real natural approach, because back then horses were tools. I mean, they were a means to get work done, to transport. They weren't a pet. But I couldn't write a story about a young girl whose horse wasn't a beloved pet. So that's kind of how I worked that in. And then I do, in every book I've written and plan to write, there will be a horse. A horse will make an appearance, either in a big way or in a small way.
That's reminiscent of My Friend Flicker. Have you read those books?
Yes, I remember those. I don't remember them real well. It's been a while.
You mentioned competing. What sort of events have you competed in?
Well, I've done just about every discipline. I've done a lot of English pleasure, saddle seat, equitation, hunter seat, dressage, which is really my love. I've done a lot of Western disciplines as well, did a lot of Western trail, Western pleasure. And I've done everything pretty much except for jumping at a competitive level. I'm not that much of a thrill seeker. So, but I loved it. It's really, as a teenager, it really helped me through those angsty years. And then as the mother of a teenager, it really helped me through those angsty years.
And you have a new book coming out in September, Grace in the Wings. Will this be a standalone or part of a new series? And can you tell us about the backstory and plot?
Yes, so Grace in the Wings is the first novel in a new series, which is the Grace Michelle mystery series. And Grace Michelle is a costume designer in the Ziegfeld Follies, 1920s. So New York City, the big lights. And she is a very introverted person, but her sister is the star of the show. And her sister mysteriously dies. And Grace is determined to find out what happened to her sister, but the only way she can do so is to step out of her introversion and become Ziegfeld's newest star. And so it culminates in this transcontinental train trip, and there's a lot of action in the book and a lot of show businessy stuff. And it was really quite fun to write.
Now it's time for Tweet of the Week, where we do a deep dive into your tweets and select one for you to expand on. You recently tweeted, "Yay, Girl with a Gun was a finalist in the Next Generation Indie Book Awards for Historical Fiction. Congratulations to all the other She Writes and Spark Press finalists and winners." So first of all, congratulations. This is a prestigious awards program that holds a gala event and has international recognition. How did you feel after becoming a finalist, and how did you find out?
Well, I found out through the internet. My publicist sent me a note saying, by the way, congratulations, this is awesome. And I didn't even know what to think, because, it's such a big awards program that I was just blown away. I was thrilled to death. So, thank you very much. It was quite a surprise, and I'm just thrilled that it happened. It was a great honor to be a finalist.
The Annie Oakley Mystery Series is available on Amazon, and you can find the link in the description below the video, as well as a link to Kari's website, karibovee.com. Grace in the Wings is coming out later this year in September, so to all viewers, make sure to check back on Kari's blog and social media for more information. It's been wonderful having you with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I've had a good time.